Hello everybody. Welcome to the second week of the Unity Study Jam. In this session, we'll be looking at what an animation is and how to deal with it, and also how to build and design your own environment in Unity. Right, so this is where we had left it off last week, where we had imported assets from Unity Asset Store, Mixamo and Sketchfab. And the last thing that we did was get this particular asset from Mixamo and also the animation along with it. But we didn't set up the animation for the character yet, and that will be the goal of this video as well. And after that, we'll move on to creating our environment in Unity. So before we set up the animation for the character, we need to know what animation is. Animation is basically giving the property of movement to inanimate objects, and there are predominantly three types of animations that people use largely. One would, and they're on these transform properties. It could either be positional, rotation, or scale. So you could basically move your object along a particular axis, or rotate it along an axis, or scale it in any of the directions you want. That is the most commonly used animation types. So we would, what we can do right now is try to create an animation for this character to on our own to just understand the concept, and then move on to setting up the animation we got from Mixamo. So there are basically some important concepts or terms that are related to animation with regards to Unity. So for that, let's head over to Window and go to Animation, click on Animation. And then you see this option to begin animating the character. Click on click create an animation clip, and that's the character that we want to animate. So let me just put create over here, and then choose the folder where you want to save this. And as you can see, it's a .anim file, which basically helps with animation. So click on save. I'm just going to save it in my assets folder itself, and you would notice that a new animation clip has been created. So this is the symbol for an animation clip. So let me just get the pane over here. Yeah, right. So here you see like some numbers, right? That represents the time. So animation, the first basic thing to understand about animation is the timeline. So anything that you do happens over a period of time. So if I want a character to move, I will keep changing its position with respect to time, and that is what animation is. So let's say I'm over here, this is 0, this is always the starting point for your animation clip, and I can go on up to whenever, like whichever time frame I want to. Right, so as you can see, when you change the value here, it keeps changing. So let's now head right into the animating part. So click on this one, and then add property gets enabled. So click on that, and then you have the options here. So head over to transform, and as I had mentioned earlier, the main types of animations we have is over position, rotation, and scale. So for an example, we'll try to change its position. So I've added that, and from the previous videos you would have seen that for position we have three parameters: the x-axis, the y, and the z-axis. So what we are going to do now is try to change one of those parameters to actually see how it works on that object. Right now at 0, so you can change which instance you want to edit. So I want to be in 0. So at time 0, I want my character to be at this position. So right now this character is here, or let me just reset the position here. So my character is at 0, 0, 0 right now. I'll head over to animation, I'll change the same over here. So what I'm essentially trying to say here to Unity is that at time 0, I want my character to be at 0. And then let me go to time 30. So as you can see, this line has moved over here. Over there, what I will do is I'll make it move, say 0.5 in the x-axis. I'll make it move 0.5 in the y-axis, and 0 on the z-axis, and 0 on the y-axis. As you can see, this particular dots, right, that represents the keyframes. the keyframe is basically like a marker that tells you at this position I want this particular location or this particular change to have been done. So in that duration this change will happen slowly. In That's the work of the Unity to get that done for you, from moving from one position to another. And then just go over to 0 and click enter here. So you can see the dots here. And then let me go to 60, and then here I'll make it move minus, or let me make it go back to 0. So that is basically done. As you can see, it will move right like this. Or I'll just drag it over here, and you can just test it out like this as well. You can see a character moving. Let me get a different perspective. Yeah. So now it's moving in a diagonal way and then coming back to the original position. So you might have noticed that there's something called an animator over here, and that is something we didn't add. But whenever you clicked on create a animation clip, right, that got added by default. So what it will do here is basically add something called the controller over here. So now let me just play this and show it to you, and then we'll head back to the topic. As you can see, the character is moving in the xy, or rather xz direction, back and forth. That's the animation that we had decided. So in this particular character, the animator it has something called the animation controller. This is the animator controller over here, and that got created by default. As you can see, it's over here. So just double click on that, and as you can see, this is basically the state graph. So what this is saying is basically on starting entry is basically like right after I click on play game, what should happen. This is basically the animation that has to be played next. So after starting, I'll head over to new animation. New animation refers to this one. So whenever you click on this particular state, you can go over to motion and just look at this, and you can choose what you want to do. So we had new animation is what we had created for the particular object. So that is what we have set in the state graph here. That is why the character is basically moving back and forth. This is the basic principle of what an animator is and what an animator controller is. As the name suggests, the controller controls how the animation works for the particular object. Now that that is clear, let's just try to get the previous animation that we had got from Mixamo. So we have a controller for the particular character, and we have an animation over here. So just click on this arrow here, and you can see the same symbol you're seeing here. So this is basically your animation clip. So what you have to do now, go over to your animator, and instead of new animation over here, you can click on slow run. So this is the one that we want. So slow run, and you can check if that worked. So I'll change the camera a little bit so that we can. Right, so just to see if it worked, now let me just click on play. Right, as you can see, the character just moved, but it just moved 2 steps and it stopped. because that is the size of the animation that we had got from the uh, store or from Mixamo. So how can we fix that? You can't make it look like it's running in just one direction, at least for now with the settings that we have. You can do it with scripting, but without that, how would you make it like at least move continuously? So let's just go back to the scene window and then click on this animation, and then you can see the inspector tab. So just click on edit. Over here there's something called the loop time that would have been disabled, if that would have been disabled depending on how you had got it from Mixamo. If you enable loop time and then try playing your game, you can see what happens there. So if you notice what's happening, it goes from 0 to say 2 steps and then goes back to the start, makes 2 steps, goes back to the start and makes 2 steps, on and on and on. That is only because of how the animation clip or how the animation is built, or the one that you got from Mixamo. And that's the reason why I mentioned in the previous video that you can enable the in place option and then use scripting later. So it's important that you understand both the types, just so that you can choose what is perfect for your game. For some cases where the direction of movement doesn't matter, this is perfect. So you can pick and choose the animation you want to do based on, or the settings you want for your animation from Mixamo based on that. So that's the overview of animation. The next topic would be basically environment. So as always, go to create scene and then let's just call this environment, and then save the settings here. So we have a new scene called environment now, and what we're going to do now is try to build what we want our surroundings of the game to look like. The environment is the first thing that the people notice when they see your game. It's just like the environment around you, the surroundings. So to do that, you can use a lot of objects or a lot of things in your environment. It's entirely up to you. And the purpose of like learning about Mixamo Sketchfab was to design your own environment. You can use all assets from there, put it in your environment. The environment is basically the structured outlook of all, like the sum total of what we have seen so far. So right now you can put anything you want in an environment. So most commonly people use terrain, and last week we had seen something called a plane. A terrain is kind of similar, but it's just more versatile. You can do a lot more with the terrain. A plane is also just a 3D object with reference to Unity. So let's try to work with terrain and understand why it's more versatile. So go to 3D objects, and then as you can see there's an option called terrain here. Just click on that. So what I'm going to try to do is reduce the size of the terrain a little bit so that it's easily accessible to me. So before I do that, let's just understand what this is doing. So in the terrain, I have some properties in the inspector tab. So they're basically neighboring terrains, paint terrains, paint trees, paint details, and then terrain settings. Each of this has a particular functionality. So fundamental major difference between a plane and a terrain is that a plane, as the name suggests, is just flat. You can't do modifications to it naturally, but a terrain is very similar to how the ground is in the real world, or how the terrain is in the real world. So you'll have bumps and you can have different types of textures, you will have trees and all that. That is the potential of what a terrain can do. So for that, just head over to your terrain settings, as I mentioned, to reduce the size. If you would scroll down, you could basically just see the terrain width, the length, and the height. So instead of having 1,000 you can have it as 100. I mean, you could still have 1,000. It's just a little big to deal with initially. So if you just reduce the size, it's going to be easier to navigate. So this is how your terrain looks. Now let's just start doing some basic modifications on the terrain. So first up, let's go to the paint terrain settings in the inspector tab, and then over there you have a lot of options: raise or lower terrain, paint texture, paint hole. So first we do raise or lower terrain. So what you're going to do here is just going to add some depth or height to your terrain. So let's say I want to make like a mountain or a hill like structure. So there you just use brush size to say how big you want it to be. Opacity refers to the strength of your brush. So if I want a very steep mountain, my opacity will be very high. If I want it to be relatively flat, and then I would have a lower opacity. So let's say I have it at the higher end. This is how it would look. But if I have it in the lower end, this is how it would look. So that's what an opacity is. Anytime you want to undo whatever you did, press on shift and then click on top of it. That's all. So let's say I want to do something like a mountain. So you could go for like the uneven textures. This would like look very unnatural. Go for some of like the uneven textures you have here. Have a decent opacity and brush size. This is all about like tinkering and figuring out which one you like the best. So there's not really a right option for this one. Let's say I just feel this looks good. So and then I have this mountain kind of a structure right now, or rather just hills. So now that's done. But it looks like it doesn't have any color right now. So that's what we'll fix. Let's just head over to paint texture and then click on edit terrain layers and then click on create layer. Wait for this to load. So here you need to basically add a texture. So what you're doing is the first texture that you add will change entirely how your entire terrain will look. So let's say I want a grass texture. So this is basically available from the package that we had imported. So the entire thing looks like the ground. So the first layer that you set is for the entire ground. Now let's say I want some portion of sand like a structure. So I'll just click on create layer. I'll see if there's anything for ground. Yeah, so this one. So now what I will do now is I'll just paint that texture over here. I'll change my brush settings, change the size. So basically if that looks very unnatural, you can go for that one or this one, something like this. So you kind of have like your mountain texture ready right now, and you can edit it however you want, and then see that would basically have it ready. Now that this is done, I would like to see some trees on my terrain. So these are all the properties of a terrain that makes it significantly different from your plane. So you can do all of these properties only on a terrain. So now let's say I just want to add a tree. All the assets that we are using right now is what I imported in one of the initial videos. So the trees was a part of that package. So what I'm going to do now is click on edit trees and add tree, and then click on the tree prefab. And as you can see, we have a lot of options. Let's just say I want to use this tree and click on add. So what you're going to do now is just like how you had painted textures on top of the terrain, you can paint trees right now. So what painting trees means is adding a bunch of trees to your terrain in a particular location. So again, the concept you need to know here is something called the brush. The brush determines the location for which you want to add your trees to, and the opacity of the brush determines how much of it you want to add. And then there are some other properties that you might want to know. So whether, like, when you're placing trees in a terrain, generally they are not like of uniform height, they are random. So you can check random height if you want for tree height. And then you can check on color variation. That will again, inbuilt default will make it look in various different colors depending on the number that you give there. These are some of the important things that you need to know. So if I give a very high density, I'll have a lot of trees when I'm placing it, but then a lower one would make it very scarce. So let's say I have 20 and then I place trees here. That's how much I'll get. 90, and this is how it looks. And then and by now you would have known what the brush size does. So that one. And then now I just try to maybe zoom in a little bit. As you can see, the trees have been placed with all these properties. Just like before, when you want to remove a tree, click on, so head back to clicking on the terrain, go to the tree's property, press on shift, and then click on the tree that you want to remove. And then if you want to add another tree, just click on add tree, choose which tree you want to add. Now let's say I want to add this one, so I could do that as well. At this stage, you might be wondering why you need to know all of this, and the main reason is to build the game. So what we are trying to do here with learning all these concepts is we're not building the game right now, but as we had mentioned, at a later point of time we'll be going through how we're going to build a game or what game we're going to build. But up to this point, you have all the tools you need to decide on what game you want to build and how you want to look, or how you want it to look. And you can even start collecting assets for your game and then getting an outlook of it ready. Making the game interactive is what we will slowly start from the upcoming videos, like how you can use scripting to control how the characters move in your game, and then how you will control other properties of your game, and all that comes under scripting. But up to this point, you have all the tools and resources you need to create a basic environment for your game and how you want it to look. And you can do much more with the terrains. This is just a basic overview. So maybe as a challenge, you could try creating a lake. Maybe if you want a hint for how you would go about that, um, what you could do is basically raise the portion in a circular manner, and then so the place in the center would be flat. Try adding a plane there and giving it texture. That will make it look like a lake, and that's a small hint. You could try implementing how to make a lake, or you could try making a valley and then make a river flow in between. The rivers is also the same way. Just raise the terrain on two sides, add a plane in the center and add some texture to it. That'll make it look like a river. And then you could try to build a forest. All these are options of what you can do with what you just learned today. Right from the upcoming videos, we'll parallelly start looking at the game that we have planned on building, and you could also parallelly start working on the game you want to build. So the next session would be about introduction to C sharp scripting. Primarily, it's going to be about that. So that brings us to the end of this session, and see you in the next one.